I chose to research the issue of water pollution, specifically in the Great Lakes. So I added some pictures to give some background. On the left are like facts about the Great Lakes, which I'll get into later, and on the right are pictures of the individual lakes. So on the top left is Lake Superior, top right is Lake Michigan. In the middle left is Lake Huron, middle right is Lake Ontario, and the bottom row is Lake Erie. So as you can see, the 5 lakes are heavily polluted as seen through the unnatural brown and green colors that the lakes are tinted, as well as the collection of unwanted plastics on shorelines. Pesticides, plastics, chemicals, and other toxic pollutants lead to the pollution of a major source of drinking water, genetic and medical problems for humans, and the death and habitat degradation for wildlife. So looking at this through a moral lens, the Great Lakes affect more than just the states that border them. It affects the United States as a whole, as well as Canada. God, goodness, and beauty are found in creation, and pollution basically destroys that. We are left with the responsibility to act accordingly towards creation. Pollution is just one of the many issues that go directly against God's will and actively destroys the beauty and goodness of a gracious gift that He bestowed upon and entrusted His people with. Water pollution affects many people and wildlife alike, degrading life and God's gift. It also threatens the health and well-being of people and depletes the natural resource of right of drinking water. We are ultimately called to care and respect for the environment, and pollution does the exact opposite. In addition, creation dates all the way back to Genesis, as seen through the picture I added on the slide with Adam and Eve, all the animals, and beautiful creation. Pollution in the Great Lakes connects first and foremost to Pillar 7, which is care for God's creation. God gave us the beautiful gift of creation and the obligation to care for and to respect it. But pollution shows the lack of respect and care for our creation. In addition, creation is given to us to enjoy and sustain our needs. Pollution combats sustaining needs because it harms drinking water and wildlife, which is also food. So, care for God's creation includes the food, air, and water. And we are called to keep until the natural world, which is seen in Genesis. And when the earth suffers, the poor suffers, which goes against God's will because He calls us to care for all of our neighbors, especially the poor and vulnerable. And due to this, the fact that when the earth suffers, the poor suffers, our care for creation is basically care for each other. And in addition to Pillar 7, pollution in the Great Lakes also relates to Pillar 3, which are rights and responsibilities. So everyone has the basic rights to life, food, water, shelter, clothing, and health care. And pollution destroys drinking water and some food sources, limiting the amount of people who can exercise these rights. In addition, everyone has human rights and dignity. So we are all called to act for the needs of others. And some statistics about the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes make up the largest surface freshwater system on Earth. They impact 8 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Nearly 40 million people, including 11 million Canadians, depend on the Great Lakes for drinking water, recreation, transportation, power, and economic opportunities. Only about 1% of the water leaves the basin, and since the Great Lakes are essentially a closed system, the pollutants remain and become concentrated. More than 90 billion liters of waste are dumped into the Great Lakes, which is basically untreated sewage, and over 360 chemical compounds pollute the Great Lakes. Causes include urbanization, trade, industrialization, agriculture, climate change, toxic contaminants, domestic waste, and more. Pollutants are pharmaceuticals, plastic, chemicals, which are persistent, toxic, and bioaccumulative. Consequences include birth defects, cancer, mercury poisoning, death of fish, and other freshwater inhabitants. So for the history for the Great Lakes, some of the origins include that the Great Lakes were formed about 14,000 years ago. In the late 1900s, the basin has begun to be used as a waste disposal site. And in the 1960s, the lakes were predominantly polluted due to the increasing industrial presence and human activity as the world population grew. Factories began to dump chemical pollutants in the lake, and there was a lack of substantial government oversight, so the problem just kept getting worse. And in the late 1960s, dead fish and green water began to become very evident, particularly in Lake Erie. And as you can see from the pictures that I included, pollution has been bad for many years, to the point where people couldn't swim in the waters starting in the 60s. Pollution is only getting worse with lack of action to fix and prevent it. And on the other hand, historical developments include the International Joint Commission to combat pollution. This Joint Commission unites Canada and the United States to fight to resolve disputes relating to the waters along their shared borders. And in the 1960s, the federal government ordered a comprehensive study of Lake Erie because it was so polluted. And it was considered dead due to all the dead fish and basically the green water, which can't be used for anything. And they began to build sewage plants and installed water filters to help reduce the pollution. Additionally, President Nixon advocated for action against pollution, specifically in Lake Michigan, in order to preserve fresh water, after seeing the effects of pollution in Lake Erie. Nixon also ordered the Environmental Council, composed of state and federal government representatives, to meet to discuss how federal environmental programs can help states with their pollution. Nixon also passed the Clean Water Act, which regulates the discharge of pollutants into the Earth's natural water sources in America. And the current events include the most obvious, which is the coronavirus. But how does that relate to pollution in the Great Lakes? While since the national attention has been completely turned toward COVID-19 and the health of citizens, many other issues have taken the back burner in midst of the crisis. Outreach and academic programs have been canceled, deteriorating education and research in regards to the Great Lakes. Summer research is in danger of being canceled due to the focus switching to studying coronavirus. Additionally, Trump has cut funding on the Great Lakes. He has recently proposed a 5% reduction in non-defense spending, including a 90% cut for the Great Lakes Cleanup Program. These very recent current events are detrimental to the issue of pollution in the Great Lakes. So now the church teaching on pollution in general, but also pollution within the Great Lakes. I studied Laudato Si and Pope John Paul II. So Pope John Paul II said that the destruction of the environment is not only an ecological crisis, but it is also a moral issue. As I talked about kind of earlier, how pollution is morally related. In addition, our mistreatment of the natural world diminishes our own dignity and sacredness, which we all have due to the fact that we are all born in the image and likeness of God. And the church seeks a society when economic life and environmental commitment work together to protect and to enhance life on this planet. He also said that the poor and powerless most directly bear the burden, which I kind of touched on in Pillar 7. But also God calls us to care for the poor and powerless, not to place this burden on them. In addition, we are stewards of the earth, so we are called to care for and respect the earth. Preserve and protect the planet for future generations is a huge point that Pope John Paul II stressed, because we are not only deteriorating the environment for our own use, but also for the people who aren't even born yet. We're destroying it for future generations that had nothing to do with the environment. He also calls for an ecological conversion. He wants us to shift our throwaway culture, where we just kind of use things for our own use and just throw it away when we're done using it. We don't really care about the effects or how it affects other people. He calls us to shift that into a more of a caring, selfless conversion, so that we view creation as something for sustaining needs and something for everyone to share equally. He also recognizes the depletion of natural resources and calls us to basically save these natural resources and take alternatives. Okay, so now some solutions or suggestions on ways to reduce the pollution in the Great Lakes. So first I made a note how everyone is called to take action against this detrimental issue. Federal and local governments, as well as individuals, are all called to act. So, first, I have changing the system, which are ways that the country, township, city, state, and federal governments um, are more easily able to implement changes. So, I have suggestions including raising funding for cleanup instead of cutting it, constructing more sewage lines and treatment systems, placing regulations on pollutants or taxes on pollutants, as well as subsidizing alternatives in order to motivate people to invest in less harmful products that are less likely to pollute the Great Lakes. I also have suggestions for individual acts of charity, so like what you could do individually. Recycling, collecting trash, using reusable products are all great ways to limit the number of plastics that enter the Great Lakes. You could wash your car on the lawn instead of in the driveway, which reduces the leaking of these chemicals into the sewage drains. Recycling motor oil, reducing auto emissions, and reducing the use of lawn chemicals, as well as creating compost, all limit the number of pollutants that could potentially enter the Great Lakes. Another suggestion is don't sweep into drains because drains lead to the Great Lakes. So sweeping into the drains could cause chemicals or literally anything toxic into the Great Lakes. And utilizing sewage plants is huge because all the sewage into the Great Lakes is just ultimately harmful and turns the water green, unusable, kills wildlife, has health effects. There's just so many things that sewage plants really could help instead of just directly putting the sewage into the Great Lakes. And a final and really easy thing to do is pray. God has the answers to everything, and if we just pray, this issue could be solved and God can help us work toward the solution.